Welcome to Spiritual Study Session 27. This is on the many curiosities of Norse mythology. This is a standalone session. For those of you who haven't been listening to the course, there's plenty to gather here. But I am referencing several things from separate sessions in the previous course. And of course, if any of this comes across as curious to somebody just listening to this one, of course, feel free to go through them. The many curiosities of Nordic mythology. The ways of tying it to the shamanic is an interesting trope here. How it speaks to many traditions far across the world in ways that don't seem so apparent. Norse mythology has really kind of blown up in certain proportions in recent years, a lot more popularity, a lot more interest around it. This is a deep dive. I'm not going over the cliche things. I'm not going over what seems all too apparent to common culture. I'm actually cutting deeper into the cloth here and tying it more to the collaborative religion end of things, how it compares, what interesting notions can we glean from its mythology, from its storytelling, from its inner kind of esotericism in comparison. So to get started, the Norse mythology and the Norse gods seem to be a bit of a stitchwork, right? So this is inherited from an old tradition that goes beyond the Roman and the Greek, although we do see that there are many similarities to the Roman and the Greek in the Norse. There's a creation story, there's many worlds. That's kind of unique to it. A tapestry, so to speak, right? But a similarity between the Nordic, Greek, Roman is that the gods and goddesses, although magical, tend to both love each other and loathe each other. They fight. There's a lot of drama that goes on with them, right? So this Old Norse is an interesting origin story. By that, it's mysterious. I mean, you could say that the first Scandinavians appear to be living in that area, in Nord's area, around 10,000 BCE. So they had been there for a very long time. But this is Germanic paganism, and so there was a common ancestor that would provide the split between the Celtic and the Norse. And based off of research, right, this split happened sometime around 200 CE or AD, right? And the Viking era, the one that, is frequently touted back to when this stuff was in its prime, was between 793 and 1066 AD. So while there was much of the rule, of the lore, of the ceremonies practiced before the Common Era, we do see that it came to its peak, its pinnacle, after the Common Era, in the early Common Era. So when speaking of the Nordic pantheon, the mythology, its canon, you're talking about the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, which were written after Christianization in the 1300s. 1200s, 1300s. And this would make certain claims of what was truly believed back when questionable, right? If it was written after in Icelandic, then there was a period of time after the beliefs had given way to Christianity, although there could have been fragmentary groups that held true to the tradition all along. But just insert a little bit of doubt or a little bit of restitching of the past that should be had, right? So first off, in order for us to speak on how much is owed in our culture, the English, right, so to speak, you have to speak of the fact that our days of the week harken back to these Norse deities that I'm to speak of, right? So let's go through the days of the week, right? You start with Sunday, right? Soul Day, literally the sun's day. This going back to Sunendag, right? Being the old Germanic sun's day, the goddess named Sol. Then you have, Mani's day, the Moonendag or the Monendag, the moon's day, Sol's brother, Norse personification, Mani of the moon. Then here's where it gets more apparent, more in your face. Tuesday is Tyr's day. Tyrs is the Norse equivalent to Mars, the god of war, the one-handed god of war. So Mars's day by the Romans, right? Then Wednesday, Woden's day. Woden is the older name for Odin, Odin's day. There's certain equivalencies that would say that Woden is like Mercury, but I would stand out on a leg and say that Odin is more likened to Jupiter or Zeus's day, right? So Woden's day, Jupiter's day. Then Thursday is very obvious, right? Thor's day. Thor, which, also tied to Zeus, right? Equivalent to Zeus in a certain way, lightning and so forth, the battler. Thor's day, thunder, strength, protection. And then we have Frey or Freya, Freya's day, the wife of Odin. So Venus's day, Aphrodite, right? So come on, guys. And of course, Saturn's day, Saturn, which wouldn't be named by the Norse back in their day. This was more of a substitution put in later by the Romans. So all of these deities, bear the names of the Norse. And when we speak of weekdays, we speak of their days, right? And it's all different astrological bodies: the sun, the moon, Mars, Jupiter or Mercury, right? I guess what would Thor? I guess maybe you'd have to give Thor Jupiter, if not Odin to Mercury. And then you have Saturn and you have Venus, right? There you go. There's the 7 astral bodies of the old world. So that really sets a precedent, right? Like how much else within our common language pays homage to our Norse history. And that's just the beginning, but I'm going to step away from that because we've got a lot to cover, a lot of different subjects. That's what I'm doing on this time, is I'm really touching on many of the nitty gritties. So first point of interest in Norse mythology is the fact that there are 3 different tiers to its many different realms, right? And we'll talk about the world tree later, but to say that we have 3 different tiers of existence: the upper level, the middle level, and the lower level, right? Obviously, Asgard, as many people may know it, on the top, Alfheim for the elves, Vanaheim for the Vanir. And I'm going to say right now, the Norse language is very sophisticated and has many nuances that are very different than English. I understand that I am butchering all of these pronunciations that I'm going to say today terribly. The Norse language tends to do a lot of the the rolling R's and these more not strong guttural sounds, but for instance, to say like Ragnarok, right? And instead of me trying to imitate the language, I'm going to speak the Anglicizations, the very English ways. So please forgive me. The middle level, Midgard for us, us being in Midgard. Jotunheim for the giants. Interesting note there. I'm not even going to try to say the one that's for the dark elves or the one that's for the dwarves. Muspelheim on the lower level. That's where the fire is, the hot world of the southern region. And Niflheim for the dead, the lowest level, what others might call hell, right? So right away in studying the Celts, there was always this trope of 9, right? 9 and on everything, the sacral number of 9. But that ultimately coming back to 3. 3 is the big deal that makes 9 a big deal, right? And here we have 3 different tiers of existence right away, and 9 in total. So harken back to that one, numerology style. So I'm going to move on to the creation story. And this has everything to do with the world of fire and ice. So I mentioned the one place for fire, Muspelheim, but then there's the other, which is Niflheim, which would be for ice, right? So fire and ice. And in the beginning, there was a chasm, or the, oh gosh, Ginnungagap, which is a power-filled space or a magical void, or the ether or akasha or the prima materia, right? Um, so in the beginning, there was the gaping abyss or the yawning void or the everything nothing blend, which if you want to hear more about that, go back into the course. So the Norse start this story the same way as many others do, but the difference here is that on one side of this void there is the fire realm, and then on the other side of the void is the ice realm, and that these two came and merged or collided, they combined, and they formed two beings. One is Ymir, which is the kind of original grandfather of the whole pantheon, and then Audhumbla, which is this cow, this sacred bovine. The bovine nourished Ymir, and the bovine sustained itself by licking the salty, icy blocks. And then from here, the bovine created its own children, starting with Bur, which I know that's kind of a funny pun there, who would be the grandfather of the Aesir, or the higher gods. And Ymir, Ymir would sweat to create the many frost giants that he would father, and that he sweated both male and female gods and goddesses under his left arm. So there's some interesting esotericism to get in here all over the place when it comes to the creation story. But I'm just going to spend a little bit of time focusing on this sacred bovine, Audhumbla. I really hope I'm not terribly butchering that. But you have the Germanic goddess Nerthus, which is this goddess of the countryside by way of a cattle-driven wagon. You have the Egyptian goddess Hathor, which is depicted with a cow head. Then you have Isis, who is also depicted with cow features and many different references. Even the Greek Hera is described as cow-eyed. Over in Hindu mythology, you have Kadmedhina, or Kadmenhunu, which is a cow, a sacred bovine. You have another primordial cow in Zoroastrian mythology. And then to bring it back to the Greek, the one I forgot to mention is Amathea, or Amalthea, which is a goat that nourished Zeus when he was hiding from his father. So, I'd be remiss to not mention that we saw that a sacred bovine, or the original creature of the cosmos, was a cow or a bull in Mithraism. And that in Mithraism, all the parts of the cow's body made the world. And so this is going to mirror very strangely with one difference here, because in this myth, in Norse mythology, Odin kills Ymir, and from Ymir, the bovine, as far as my knowledge goes, never dies. It just remains eternally. But Ymir gets killed by Odin, who is one of the gods formed from the sacred bovine. The blood of the giant killed all the frost giants except for one, and from Ymir's body, everything was created. So you see here, it's not the cow or the bull that gets that gets killed and creates everything. Here it's Ymir, which this will come back later. So one thing that's fashioned from his body is the goddess Urd, which is the mother goddess, Mother Nature, Mother Earth. So Mother Earth is fashioned from Ymir's body. So here we have the mother goddess. which is another trope, to always touch on. So we see the mother goddess here in the Nordic pantheon as well. But as we know, the true goddess centricism would survive in the Celts, but it wouldn't make it so much to the Nords. The Nords still very much held tried and true to the patriarchy, although they did have very secular, equal rights for women in several ways beyond the common class of the world at the time. But anyhow, from his flesh came the earth, the goddess, came the world from his flesh. His blood, the ocean. His bones, the mountains. From his hair, the trees. From his brains, the clouds. From his skull, the heavens. From his eyebrows, the middle realm in which mankind lives. So, and the dwarves are said to have been from potentially different sources. It could have been from his flesh and blood, but there's also an account to say that the dwarves were formed from the worms that crawled across Ymir's corpse. So why did Odin kill Ymir, right? And it wasn't just Odin alone. It was also Odin and his brothers, but they don't get as mentioned as much as Odin, of course. There's a common trope in Norse paganism that you never get anything for free. If you want to achieve something, you have to give something. And we're going to see this trope play out later throughout this talk. Freya gave her powerful sword to win the heart of the giantess. Tyr lost his arm in order to earn peace in Asgard. There is a transaction, a sacrifice that needs to be made. And the first sacrifice was the death of Ymir. Ymir was the original aging father of it all, right? So in this way, it was a matter of time based off of mythology and the old, tropes of mythology, that the death of the original father would happen. And that change would come from this death. So all of creation was formed from his death. And Odin stepped up to the mantle accordingly. So even though he was a god, Ymir, there had to be a time where he must die, as they all do, as all the gods of Norse pantheism do in some way, shape, or form. Which is another thing to note very quickly, how very human the gods of Norse pantheism are, which we saw in the Celts as well, almost seamless between, there was almost very little difference between humanity and the gods. This would make them much more relatable, much more personable, much more of a ruling story instead of they're so perfect we can't even relate to them. Yeah, take that note with you. So all the old things must perish in order to bring in the new world. That's the rule of nature. And there's a secondary reason, and that is this thing of fate, which we'll talk about plenty in this session as well. But the beginning sows the seeds of the end. For Odin to kill Ymir was the first step towards Ragnarok, or the end story. The death of Ymir would bring the end of creation, or the world, or the realms. So it's not so much that anything could have changed. It had to be that way. So even if it was out of a sort of conspiracy or out of a bit of evil, retribution would be had again, and all things would be equalized. The ending mirrors the beginning. So interesting here that the Greek, I'm not saying not the Greek, the Norse pantheon mirrors itself in such an interesting way. So here's a side note that I want to hop on. This Mother Earth thing, Jord, the wife of Odin and the mother of Thor. Very short note, right? Just to say that this is a direct way of saying earth or land or soil or dirt. All these things are a little reference to, what Jord is. and Jord, being the mother goddess, is literally these things. So the personification is a direct anthropomorphization, right? To show her as a woman is very well known, that she is in fact being shown as a woman, but she is in fact the dirt, the earth, the gravel. So it's a lot more of a, pun unintended, earthy approach to the gods, that the names themselves speak directly to what they are in the Norse language. So moving on, I want to talk about Yadrasil or Yggdrasil, or the world tree, because from Ymir's body grew this ash tree, Yadrasil, whose branches covered and interconnected and was the whole universe, right? And this trope, there's a lot of esotericism to take from this, right? Kabbalah, the tree of life, the connection of all these different realms, the sacred geometry, or the continual pattern of the vein structure. I mean, take a look at your body's veins, take a look at a tree, take a look at the inner cut of a cauliflower, right? All these things are a mirroring of each other. So Yadrasil is much more of an esoteric symbol than one might imagine. So you have one route that goes up into Asgard. You have all the roots that go out to all the different realms and different ley lines per se. And this idea of Yadrasil is a kind of homage to shamanism, the shamanism that would spread its way from the Neolithic, the Paleolithic, all throughout Eurasia. And the idea here is that in shamanic trance, in these hypnagogic states, your way of getting to different worlds, your way of experiencing different mystic visionary quests, was to follow the tree, the rising tree that connected you to the other realms. So this tree trope goes way, way back. So it's no accident that Yadrasil is a tree, a central tree that may be used as a ladder to ascend to the heavens and to enter the lower realm, which is a whole other discussion. But here we're specifically saying that Yadrasil is an ash tree, not just any old tree, but an ash tree. And so then we have to talk about, why is it an ash tree? So for the Celts, as we've mentioned before, this tree represented a great many things. It was a type of nourishment, and one of the very key features is its stability, that it was structured, that it offers a symbol of stability and security for the people, and it doesn't tolerate those who are too concrete and those that are too spiritual. It demands both. And that the ash was viewed as a connection between the heavens and the earth. So as above and as below. And that this was literally involving the flow of energy between two different existences, two different spheres, two different phenomena. And that the tree itself medicinally would cure children of certain diseases by means of its bark, and that it would be used for protection rituals, believing that it carried these great energies of the heavens and of the earth within it, containing it as like a vessel. The protection thing most notably is associated with children and protecting them from evil. A healing agent, herbal teas, herbal preparations, both in the Nordic myths and in the Celtic. And I'm mentioning the Celtic here to talk about the Germanic roots that would inspire this, right? So is also a symbol of rebirth, initiation, and transformation. And that this was very much practiced by the Druids in various rituals and ceremonies. And that young warriors were given a lance made out of the wood of the ash tree. And this is symbolic in many ways. So, if one was to have a ritual to bring up spring, to incite the plants emerging from the numbed winter sleep, they would burn the ash. The ash would awaken the plant spirits and bring the spring rains. So you could say that this is magic or witchcraft or whatever. It's a ceremonial, medicinal, sacred tree. And they would create talismans that out of the tree that they would use to protect them against drowning, or to protect them against other diseases from coming, not just treating diseases that have formed, but protect them against hernias, bone fractures, rheumatism. So medicinal purposes, protection purposes, magical, witch, folklorish purposes. It would even protect you from snakes, because they witnessed that snakes would flee from the shadow of the ash tree. And so, curious note there, right? We're going to talk about snakes quite a bit here. And so accordingly, the ash was used as a remedy against snake bites. And this was true all the way up to the 1900s. So let's get back to actually talking about Yadrasil. That helps explain why the use of the ash in particular is so. The ash, is the ubiquitous, most sacred of trees. I would guess, or I would educatively guess on behalf of the Nords. So here's a quote. Odin hanging from the tree. I know that I hung on a windy tree 9 long nights, wounded with a spear dedicated to Odin, myself to myself, on that tree of which no man knows from where its roots run. And so it describes how Odin had no food, no drink, and peered downwards and took the runes. And we're going to talk about all this for a second. So there's an interaction between Yadrasil and Odin, where Odin is sacrificing himself to the tree. Take note. So Odin, let's talk quite a bit about Odin. So apart from this transcosmogenic tree, right? Nobody knows how old Odin is. And by that, I'm not talking in mythos. I'm saying we don't know how long Odin has been worshipped. So there are many ways we say Odin, but there's also Odin or Wotan or Woden. And of course, we already know that Wednesday is named after Odin, and that Odin is the husband of Frigg and the father of Thor, Balder, Hoder, and Vali, and is regarded as the Allfather, the father of all gods. So this is quite a haughty title, depicted as a elderly man missing an eye, carries a spear that never misses its mark. And there's a sigil, or there's a rune for this, giving something the power of never missing its mark. So while he is a god of battle and death, he is also the god of knowledge and poetry. And the mythos tells you how he achieved the ranks of being the god of knowledge and poetry. And we're going to start by explaining how he became the god of poetry. So Odin knew of the mead of poetry. So this is a literal drink. And Odin worked in a field for a winter and a summer to impress upon the men that had the mead of poetry, completing the work of 9 men. See, there it is, the trope. 9, right? There it is. But was still refused the drink of the mead. So he tricked one of them into creating a hole, and then Odin transforms into a snake. So here we see that Odin is capable of shape-shifting, which is a much older trope that we've talked about in this course, but into a snake of all things, which I find very esoterically interesting. Crawls through, meets the lady that's guarding, a giantess, a lady that's guarding the mead of poetry, and he sleeps with her. Gunlad, I think it's how it's said. He sleeps with her for 3 nights, and each night when he sleeps with her, she allows him to take a drink of the mead. And by the 3rd night, he drank it all up. and then he turned into an eagle and flew out of there. And upon returning and upon being chased, he spat the mead into these containers. And that one of the dwarves, Dvalin, offered a drink of the mead of poetry to men. So here is a direct gifting, not only the story of how it became the god of poetry by drinking this interesting substance, right? And basically everything is mead to the mead was very sacred to these cultures, right? So it's no wonder it takes that form. But to give poetry to man as a thing of the gods. So you can see how highly the Norse people prized poetry, right? We could really use some of that mead nowadays, huh? Okay. So that's how he became the god of poetry. But then comes the god of knowledge, which is how I'm going to talk about Yadrasil again. The idea of sacrifice here. The root of the tree near Nelfheim goes into what is called the Weird's Well, or the Well of Urd, or Mimir's Well, or the Well of Urd. And this is a very curious thing, this holy well, these holy waters. This is where the gods held their court. And it's a specific place that feeds the tree, or feeds Yadrasil, the world tree. Mimir is this kind of ubiquitous smart guy, knowledge, wise, and he's frequently drinking from the well. And Odin is seeking these things, by the way, because he has a fear of Ragnarok. He has a fear that he will be killed, and he wants to change everything. So he's acquiring all these things for the greater good in his eyes, or perhaps for self-preservation. So Odin goes to this well that bestows knowledge. But the price for drinking it requires sacrifice. To achieve this knowledge requires sacrifice, and not a small one. So Odin hangs himself from the tree, and that's the quote I was reading earlier. And it seems that he pierced himself with his own spear and gave his own eye. So when Odin's depicted missing an eye, he literally sacrificed all these things to be hung, to be stabbed, and plucking out his own eye to drink of the tree of or to drink of the well of wisdom. And this is where Odin remained there for 9 days and 9 nights. There it is, 9. 3 times 3. Odin learned 9 mighty spells here and drank that precious mead. Drank that water, right? I want to mention real quick here before I move on. The 9 thing is a magical number. It's symbolism. If you really want to geek into it, you got to go down numerology, and you can even figure out why in mathematics as well. Well, you need to figure out why in both if you really want to see the picture. So the sacrifices that were made and the knowledge that was gained was for the knowledge of the runes. So the runes, in this way, you're getting an origin story for the runes. The knowledge of the runes were only for the dead, interestingly enough. So that is why Odin sacrificed so much. He sacrificed himself for this knowledge to become dead, to achieve it, and to bring that knowledge. This is a very convoluted and interesting story. So a hangman's noose around his neck, meaning that Odin was coined the god of the hanged. And on the 9th night that coincided with the festival of May Eve, or Walpurgis night, or April 30th, which go to the Celt talk if you want to learn more about that, Odin mastered the 9th and final spell and ritualistically died. And, here it is. the god, the dying god trope, which is something I'm not going to talk a lot about here, but it's a thing that happens throughout many religions and not just Jesus. So interesting here how the rune story has an origin in its own mythology, the runes that we still see to this day. Odin's death lasted until midnight and would return to the world upon next light. So a curious note here. So here's where there's more mythology, but the people of the Germanic tribe before the Norns, called the Cimbri, were recorded to have held a festival very similar, or a ritual very similar to this. They sacrificed their victims to what they called Wodan, not Odin, but the older form, Woden, which is why we can't say how old it is, which the Romans watching this likened it to Mercury again. And they would hang their victims over a cauldron that would be bled into. Again, the hanging god, the representation of the hanging god. The priestess would cut their throats and they would bleed into the cauldron, and their bodies were thrown into sacred lakes. And this custom seemed to have nothing to do with runes back when. This was just a sacrifice to appease Odin. So the story seemed to have made a change in Norse mythology, or among the Norse, and a way back when, and a way in the Norse mythology to know if an offering was confirmed by Odin was the sight of a raven. As you see in depictions of Odin, you'll see ravens all, about him, two of them, Hugin and Munin, which these are curious too, being the god of knowledge. The crows are representations of thought and memory, Hunin and Munin. And they would fly out every day and come back to Odin at night and tell him of all that was thought and remembered. So we're getting really high magician magi vibes from Odin. And we're also getting the dying god, the hanged god vibes from Odin. So very curious character, and I wanted to spend a good amount of time talking about him because of this fact. There's a lot more to him than how he's depicted in film. One thing that I didn't mention, so I'm going to spend more time here talking about the Well of Urd that I mentioned before, because there's a lot to dig into here. In the Well of Urd, it is inhabited by 3 Norns, or the goddesses of fate. So no, Greek pantheism isn't the only one that has the fates, except in Nordic, the 3 Norns, or the 3 goddesses, are Urdur, Verdandi, and Skuld, which literally mean the past, the present, and the future. 3 goddesses of fate, the past, the present, and the future. This is, I can't be the only one that finds this so interesting. That fate is the interplay between these 3 goddesses. That the past, the present, and the future involve each other in regards to fate. That the beginning is the end. And they inhabit this Well of Urd, right? And so in the stories, right, beneath Yadrasil, the evergreen ash tree, it's covered in a white mud or a loam. And that here dwells the 3 Norns that come from the well of knowledge, of all knowledge. And they set down laws, they choose lives, and they dictate the lives and what happens to the sons and fates of men and fathers and everyone by that. And even the gods, right? So they know everything. And mind you, this is where the knowledge of the runes come from, and the runes are divinatory. So they came from the well of knowledge, from the Well of Urd. And so in this way, that's why the runes are divinatory, and that's why the runes can tell you about the future. So there's a lot of speculation as to why this is called the Well of Urd. And word is the way of saying it. And this is interesting, right? Because in my mind, I directly want to jump to in the beginning there was the Word, right? And that everything, gosh, this is so esoterically rich. Everything is about the Word. Every bit of knowledge, every bit of saying. Saying is the act of knowing, receiving, learning, the invention of the word, of the abstraction of noise is what creates all knowledge and all beginnings. But that's a whole nother note. And that might be me making my own interpretation here, because the only thing that really, by etymological standards, derives from this root is the word weird. So the weird's well, the weird well, which by our English standards, it doesn't really have the same kick, right? But in this more etymological dig, we find that it literally means fate in certain ways, that it can be traced back to words for fate. So, and it's also a rune. And this rune signifies destiny as well as the unknown, and that it's really tied to mystical experiences. You know, it means to what comes to pass, what becomes, what is due, the origin, what has worth, you know, the word worth, honor, dignity, identity, esteem, affiliation, right? And that these three Norns are these kind of inhabitors of the weird, literally the well of fate. And there's a lot of speculation to be had about this, but I'm going to leave it at that because I got to move quickly. So the story of human origination. Where do humans come into this story? Where do humans inhabit Midgard? So Odin and two other gods, in two different accounts it's said differently. It could be Vili and Ve, or it could be Honor and Loder. But he was walking with two different gods and came upon driftwood off the coast. And their form resembled a man and a woman. And they said, they made the initiative to bring life to them. And Odin blew the breath of life into them. See, here's the trope, right? Breathing the breath of life that we see across all different mythologies. Odin breathes the life into the driftwood bodies, and his two companions gave them mentality, like mental activity, and the other gave complexion, healthiness, ability to speak and hear. And then they gave them clothes, and they named them Ask and Embla. Ask and Embla are the originating mother and father of the human species in this way. Not Adam and Eve, but Ask and Embla. And they were given to Midgard, the world of human civilization. This is where you dwell. Which, by the way, Ask is the man and Embla is the woman. And the name means ash and elm. Trees. And an interesting quote here. Man has his feet on the ground, anchored in this world with roots, ties to death and chaos in his nature. But his crown, his head, his mind is the mental and spiritual world. So the literal embodiment of the tree. We are the tree, man. Like the world tree, it has the upper, the middle, and the lower all involved in it. The evil and the divine, you see. And this is so hearkening to Kabbalism. So much Kabbalism in this. So, man involves the world above and the world below, and lives in Midgard, lives in the middle of it all. So a lot of more poetry, you know, and that the link between these realms was given by the gods to man. Interesting. So the chief gods here in Norse mythology are the Aesir. And you have also the Vanir. So the Aesir are more involved in conflict. And the Vanir are more inclined towards softer things, fertility, prosperity. And then you have a third group of people in the pantheon, the Jotnir, which are the giants, but also the elves and the dwarves. So in this way, you have three different types of people, you see. And man, I guess, is a weird fourth exception to this. I want to move on to another interesting tie-in with other cosmologies. Night, or what the Old Norse would say, Noit. Very beautiful giantess goddess, skin and hair as dark as the night. And she literally is night, but personified as a goddess. She's the daughter of a Jotun, or a giant, Norvi, and is one of the first, Norvi is one of the first giants in Norse mythology. And that Nut is married 3 different times. Now, do I need to say, right? Waxing, waning, full, 3 different husbands. I'm not going to mention all the details here, but the second husband, Einar, literally the marriage and the copulation between Einar, which means dawn, or no. The copulation with Einar and night creates earth, Jord, as I mentioned before. So here, night is the mother of the earth. Interesting. And her third husband, Delingir, is dawn, the personification of dawn. And so dawn and night get together and they have a son, Dagr, or Degir, which means day. The Dach, the day. So night is the mother of day. The dawn and night mating makes day. Interesting. So since night is the mother of day, this is unlike the Egyptian pantheon, which Ra, sun Re, sun rise, sun Ra, and Set, sun Set, were eternally in conflict with each other, or at least that's how it's depicted. So in this way, it's different, but in other ways, we'll see that it's similar. So night is the mother of day here, so it's a good relationship. Dagar in Norse is, or day, is bright, beautiful, and is just like the highness of his father's family. This Dag, is reminiscent of the Celtic deity, the Celtic Allfather, Dagda. Dagda is the Allfather, the bright one, the illuminated one. So we see some interesting commingling here, not direct, but commingling. So night and day are both given a chariot by Odin to ride across the heavens in the skies until Ragnarok. And Dagar his chariot is pulled by a shining mane, Skinfaxi. And Night's chariot is pulled by the frost mane, Hrimfaxi. And this depiction of the gods riding chariots across the sky is just like Ra. Ra rides a chariot across the sky in Egyptian mythology. And in Norse, you have Skull and Hati, which are these 2 giant wolves that chase the sun and moon in hopes of devouring them. And when they do, it will be the end of the world, or Ragnarok. And in Egyptian, you have Apep, or Apophis, the serpent, the Leviathan that chases Ra in hopes of eating him and creating the end of the world. So not exactly the same, but you see that Egyptian and Norse mythology have a common ground. They have a common root of the tree, per se. So I'm going to move on from that, talk about the world serpent. I'm very fascinated about this. I mentioned this in the snake and mythology talk. The world serpent is the son of Loki, who we'll talk about later. Jormungandr, I hope I'm butchering that, I know it, is born and is tossed into the great ocean that encircles Midgard, and that the serpent grew so big that it surrounded the earth and took grasp of its own tail in its mouth. It received the name, thus the world serpent or Leviathan. And that this is a perfect example of Ouroboros, which is an esoteric thing that I'm not spending time in. And allegedly, Ouroboros originated, I'm putting this in quotes, originated in Egyptian mythology, but I would say it's much older than that. But in this story, interestingly enough, Jormungandr, or the world serpent, is arch enemies with the thunder god. Sound familiar? Oh, the thunder god and the serpent fighting. Kind of sounds like Zeus and Typhon, or Marduk and Tiamat, or God and Leviathan. Seems like they have a common root here. The third battle between the world serpent and Thor. The third battle, right? Of course, the third battle. And this is in Ragnarok, mind you, Thor does kill the world serpent, but is poisoned. Thor is poisoned by its venom. Thor takes 9 steps away and dies from the poison. 9 steps, of course. But the world serpent isn't the only example. There's many examples of serpents in Norse mythology. The other one that I'm going to mention is Nidhogg. And Nidhogg's, the name literally means the terror of corpses. By the way, overall, in Norse mythology, it is not kind to serpents at all. Other faiths would be different in that respect. But this Nidhogg gnaws perpetually at the deepest root of Yadrasil, or the world tree. So there's something really interesting here, right? And at the top of the world tree is an unnamed eagle. So this is, you'll see, if you know anything about Mesoamerica, right? The eagle and the serpent fighting is this ancient esoteric trope. And I'm not getting into that in this talk, although soon, wink, wink. But this bird, this unnamed eagle, is, perched up on the top. There is a name that I'm not going to try to pronounce, but it's not its name. It's just meaning that it is storm pale or wind bleached in appearance. And that it sits up there, and a squirrel, Radataskir, carries messages between the eagle and the serpent eating at the bottom of the tree. And this is an old trope, which it's fascinating to find it here, all taking place around Yadrasil. Anyhow, let's move on. The Rainbow Bridge. The Rainbow Bridge. In Zoroastrianism, there is the Shavat Bridge, the bridge of the Requiter. We've talked about this once before in the course, which separates the world of the living and the world of the dead, and that all souls must cross this bridge after death. This bridge is guarded by 2 4-eyed dogs. You see this trope in Zoroastrianism, you see it in Hinduism, and you see it in Greek. In Greek, it's in hell, or in Hades, and it's Cerberus. and that depending on the person's asha or their righteousness, the person is either brought to the house of lies or the druji damana, a place of eternal punishment, which would be like hell, or they are brought to the house of song. And right here, this use of the bridge is tying it back into the ancient world significantly, right? Ooh. The Shavat bridge is identified with the rainbow. And then here in Norse mythology, we have two bridges. Here's the difference, two bridges. The one that goes unmentioned, Joel's bridge. This bridge goes into the underworld, or what might be called hell or Niflheim. And according to the description, it is a covered bridge thatched with glittering gold. It's depicted in the story of the death of Balder. And that on this bridge is a giant maiden, Muldgad, who demands that anyone who comes state their name and their business before being allowed to pass. So here's some troll vibes. You're getting everything in Norse mythology. It's great. And then the one that people know, which is the opposite, which is the Bifrost. And the Bifrost or the Bifrost or the Bifrost is a burning rainbow bridge that reaches between Midgard and Asgard. So this bridge goes up. So here's the difference, right? Not one bridge that goes both ways and splits, but two different bridges that go opposite directions in the upper and in the lower. And you know, people know this one. This one's been depicted in film, right? And the Bifrost is the shimmering path. Bil meaning moment potentially, or bifa meaning to shimmer or to shake, which all of this might tease at the fact that the rainbow bridge is fleeting. You can barely see it, like a rainbow, you know, just for a moment. This bridge is what leads one to Valhalla, into Asgard. Valhalla, as many people know, is, you know, to Valhalla, right? Where all the warriors wanted to go. The god Odin says that Valhalla is located in the halls of Asgard. And the halls of Asgard are called Valhalla, or the shining and golden halls in Asgard. So now we kind of start to get into the afterlife aspect, which this is very curious of its own right too. So those who die in combat go to Valhalla, because those who are chosen live among the Valkyrie and the celebrated heroes that will eventually fight in the battle of Ragnarok. So they go there because they will most be utilized. They want to fight. They are spirits that want to fight. So they go to Ragnarok to wait for the final battle, which it's amazing that the final battle is a battle, like a big battle. But in truth, the Norse view on the afterlife is very complicated and has multiple parts and paths and gray. There's a lot of gray about the situation, because in other literature, you see that Freya welcomes the dead into her hall as well, or the fields of the people, or the fields of the warriors. So you could go to Freya's domicile, basically, or those who die at sea are taken to the abode of Ran, the giantess. Or you see that most of the time, what you would assume is that everybody else goes to hell or Helheim, right? But hell, I want to make this very clear, is not the miserable place as it's been depicted from henceforth. This is a retroactive Christianization. I told you right from the beginning that the Eddas were written after Christianization, right? So by all accounts, hell is not a bad place. The Christians needed hell to be a bad place when they took over the idea. But what do people do in hell in the Nordic pantheon? They eat, they drink, they fight, they sleep, they practice magic. They live like they would have. They live like any other person would have. And so it's not this necessarily terrible place. All that can be said about it is that hell literally means subterranean, down into the earth. But even me saying this alone isn't enough, because there are strange references to reincarnation in Norse mythology as well. So it's not just that you would go to different realms per se. It's not that you would just go to different places, that you would rotate around the tree Yadrasil, right? But you could also be reincarnated. And there was this idea that you would be reincarnated if somebody was named after you. So then you would embody them. Interestingly enough, this is a very unique deviation from most reincarnation tropes across the world. Anyway, there is also this play on the commingling, or the transmigration of souls between elves and humans. So the elves, they're the light elves and the dark elves in Norse mythology. But in these ancient names, you see that there was this belief. Names like Alfred and Alvin. I talked about this in the mythology talk, or in the creatures of mythology talk, that the elves were viewed to have become human, and people have become elves. So there is a transactional end to things here too. So the afterlife is very ambiguous, and there are many different explanations, not just one. And lastly, I want to talk about Loki. Loki is problematic in the pantheon. You could see that Loki is actually a trickster god. And this is a trope that happens in many religions, in many folk storytelling as well. Loki, by the way, it's been suggested by scholars that Loki was the original inspiration for the myth of Lucifer. Look into that if that's curious to you. So, by nature of the trickster, they violate social and natural order in some way. They bend and break rules. They are both potentially very good and potentially very bad. They could be like thieves, which this is very lightly embodied in Mercury and Hermes, a very watered down trickster god. That's why I think that Loki is more like Mercury than Woden is. Gosh, it's such a mixed bag. They all kind of include one another. But trickster gods are cunning, They disrupt. They offer questions, and they mock authority. And they're most often male. That's the other trope that we see. They play tricks on everybody, gods and humans. And in Norse mythology, you see many of these tropes in Loki. And by the way, the films have done Loki so wrong. They've so watered it down. It is frequently trickster gods exhibit gender fluidity and shape shifting. And Loki is no different. Loki has taken the form of, well, I'll get to that later. But has taken the form of a woman and become pregnant even. Loki was pregnant. So, well, I'm not going to get into that. And he becomes a mare who later gives birth to Odin's 8-legged horse Sleipnir. So Loki is such a trickster that he's not only a father to many gods, but he's also a mother. And this trope of the trickster god goes all the way to the natives. Coyote, the old man Coyote in the Crow, impersonates the creator. Old man Coyote takes up a handful of mud and made people out of it. Coyote names the buffalo, the deer, the elk, the antelope, and the bear. And in Chelan, which is right by where I live, by the way, the Chelan myth, I live in Wenatchee, which, you know, Chelan's right above here. The Chelan people, Coyote belongs to the animal people, but at the same time has the power just like the creator and is the head of all the creatures. And although has the power, the creator can punish and remove the trickster or the coyote's power. Coyote is mentioned as a messenger, like Hermes, like Mercury, right? And has minor power in comparison. So here we're seeing that Coyote does transformation, resurrection, medicine, and even shape-shifting. Can create new ways of the river, changing the ways of the river, create new landscapes, getting sacred things for the people. All these things can be done by the trickster. So there's a lot of variation, but I'm bringing up all these variations to talk about the trope. And the trope here is that Loki is this trickster god and is an interesting deviation from the trickster god. And sometimes Loki assists, and other times he ruins everything. And in taking shape, he's taken the form of an elderly old woman, taking the form of a salmon, a mare, a fly, which we've seen that many gods can do shape-shifting. But Loki resulted in the death of Balder, which incites him to be imprisoned and eventually leads to Ragnarok, or the end of the world. And so I want to take a moment here. Out of all, right, like in Mercury and in Hermes, the trope of the trickster really was diluted. And in Europe, for the trickster god trope to survive is a very interesting nugget that goes way back to shamanism, right? Like I'm telling you right here that the natives still have it, right? So this brings Norse way back, way back, and that they held on to this concept of Loki. So you have to pay attention there to what that says about history. But to get back to concentrating on Norse, Loki escaping his imprisonment incites Ragnarok. And this is, you know, how the trickster god incites the end of the world. That this type of mischievousness would bring about the end. But like I said from the beginning, with the death of Ymir, the end was fated from the very beginning, and how the beginning mirrors the end, and how awesome at Ragnarok truly is, right? Because all the gods do die. This is true. Some of them are brought back. I mean, Marvel is highly inspired, right, by all this. And what's interesting is that from this destruction, a new world, a new beginning, a bright beginning, a utopia is birthed. So it's not just beginning, end. It is the cyclical nature of things. So the end of the world isn't the end at all. It goes on. And it's just, you know, with all the characters that come back, with it all wraps itself up nicely. With all the different tales that happen throughout the Norse mythology, it all comes back, and retribution is had on all fronts. So the end is always hinted at in the stories, and the stories always and the story of the end hints back to all the things of before, past, present, and future, involving each other. The Norns, man. So I'm gonna stop here because you know, I've already taken up way more time than I should. But Norse mythology, from a comparative religion perspective, is a vestige of the ancient past. They had held on to things that had long been diluted in the Western world. The trickster god, the sacrifice of the hanged god, the rainbow bridge, the chariots of the sun and moon, the relationship of night and day. I mean, on and on and on. The giants. I didn't even spend time talking about the giants, right? Here you get so much lore about the giants, whereas in Christianity, you get these offhand references, you know, the Nephilim so much. You even get mention of the prima materia, the ether, the akasha, in the primordial substance of the universe. You get different realms. It ties to Kabbalism. You in all of its mythology as a standalone is great, but in comparison to historical context, um, I'm very grateful that this survived in comparison to the Celts, right, and how much was destroyed. Very interesting to look into this deeper. And the more that one learns through esotericism, the more that one can stand to benefit understanding the many myths of Norse mythology.